Some people might not find my humour funny. I'm quite dry and absurd. Perpetrators often pick those, they can see it, they pick those circumstances. They also often pick careers deliberately that give them access to children.
I'm feeling uncomfortable how the system let you down. It let you down. Welcome back to part 2 of my chat with Grace Tame, 2021 Australian of the Year, a childhood sexual abuse survivor and an advocate and activist for survivors of child sexual abuse. Welcome back, Grace.
Thanks for having me back, Gary.
Back, having you back.
It's been a long 20 minutes or less, actually. It's been 10 minutes.
We create the illusion. We're not sure. Well, I think they go out over 3 days. So it's good to have you back 3 days later. Now, you mentioned, just before we get into some very hard subject matter, you mentioned you performed at the Melbourne Comedy Festival. That's true.
I performed this year and last year at the Melbourne Comedy Festival.
Tell me about that.
Well, one of my friends, Dan Illich, who's a fantastic comedian, he runs the Irrational Fear podcast. He invited me last year to join the panel, and I thought, I'll give it a crack. And we had a lot of fun. Yeah, Lewis Hobber was on the panel last year and this year as well, and then some other great comedians. Gabby Bolt did it last year as well, and this year. And
you're nervous when you got up?
To me, it's a language that comes to me quite naturally. Obviously, humour is subjective. Some people might not find my humour funny. I'm quite dry and absurd. Last year, I did what was largely a self-roast. I compared myself to an air fryer, and I started off with some jokes. My one rule with comedy, I think sometimes the best jokes are more absurd and colourful. I think it's a great art form that you can use to explore all kinds of different concepts. And sometimes I like the marriage of complete silliness with intellect. I like the balance of the two. A lot of the times it's just about timing, and sometimes unplanned stuff is really funny.
Timing is so interesting. I did a tour last year, I Catch Killers live tour, with my good friend Rob Carlton, who is an actor and writer. Enmore Theatre was the first time we performed, and a full audience Saturday night, and I was so nervous walking out. And Rob was saying, because I thought it would be a sort of sit-down chat, and so when you join the police force, that type of thing. And Rob said, "No, idiot, this is theatre. We're going to take the audience on a ride." And I'm stressing out. He's gone, "It's not hard. You just got to play yourself stupid," because there was a lot of monologues that we had to deliver and all that. But I found it a really empowering experience, but it was a draining experience. And I would imagine, getting up in front of an audience, you'd come up on a high. Did you come off on a high?
Yeah, well, I love that communication though. I love standing up and just freely engaging with people and having a good time. To me, that's sort of being in church. Well, first of all, nature is my church. Going outside, being in the ocean. Max and I, my fiance Max and I love to surf. And when I run on trails and stuff like that up especially up the mountain that we have in Tasmania. I like that conversation when you are in front of an audience, and especially when it's just a rare spark that happens out of nowhere, and the audience all erupts in laughter, and and sometimes you break yourself, and you what's called corpsing when you're trying to be serious, and I like to be able to laugh at myself, and like I said before, my rule is that you got to always try to punch up or punch on.
But good on you. I think it takes a lot of courage to get up there and do that. But I can see just with the smile on your face how much enjoyment you get from it. So hopefully we'll see some more of Grace Tame live at the Comedy Festival. Okay, talking about the sexual abuse when you're a kid. It wasn't when the teacher sexually abused you. that wasn't the first time. That happened earlier when you were a
No.
six-year-old.
Yeah.
And I only want you to talk about what you're comfortable here talking about. So I'll just feed you the line, and you take us where you want to talk about it. But as a 6-year-old.
Yeah. Well, it must be said. So first of all, Gary, I just appreciate the vibe. So, whenever you have a conversation with someone, or you're sharing something that, especially that's really personal. It's about time and place, and I just have to say, I really appreciate the atmosphere, and I feel quite comfortable. Obviously, this is something that you've done a lot with a lot of people, and you've got a lot of experience in this field. And sometimes it's not easy to talk about with certain people, and you can feel it. You can feel the vibe. It's difficult to share, but I still remember seeing the shafts of light in the closet that I was asked by this older child to get into, to undress before I was molested. I was molested sitting down on my bottom bunk bed when I was about 6 years old, and there were 4 of us all together who were sexually abused by this older child, and all of us have now, in recent years, spoken about it together and worked through it to, the extent that one can work through something like that. And for me personally, and other people who will have different feelings about this, and this is important, that people, however people want to process their trauma is how they do it on their terms. But for me, that's something that's different to, a much older recidivist who really is carefully plotting and planning their abuse. Children will offend on other children, and some children are offending on other children because they themselves have actually been sexualized or abused by an older person. And also, maybe they haven't been sexualized or abused by an older offender, but that does happen, And I have made as much peace as I can at this point in my life with that experience. It is still difficult in some ways, especially because in my case, it became something that fed into the abuse that was perpetrated against me when I was 15 by my teacher. Because when I was in high school and I was dealing with some of the instability that was an undercurrent in my whole childhood. My parents were divorced when I was about 2 years old, and I didn't have a set base. I was moving constantly. It was 4 days, 3 days, and it was sort of always very turbulent. I'd also had some other experiences that were quite confronting. I wrote about in the book that when I was about 8 years old, a friend of mine and I were tied up with big, thick ropes and taunted by these much older teenagers. And there were other things, you can pinpoint lots of other things. And some of these things are just things that kids go through, and it makes up the fabric of your life. And there were, of course, really positive memories that I had, and I had good close friends, and all of my cousins I'm really close to. We all, a lot of us were close in age, and we spent a lot of time together in 7 Mile Beach, which was the suburb that a lot of us grew up in together. But when I was in early high school, and we were learning about sex education, and these memories were coming up. I never really suppressed them. I remember telling my mum when I was about 10 years old what had happened to me when I was 6. They sort of started coming up within a new context where I was recognizing them as bad. I was struggling with an eating disorder, and that was really bad when I was 14. I was hospitalized for about 6 weeks. And that was the year that Mr. Bester taught me. And looking back on it, and I especially realized this when I wrote my book, looking back on that year, on 2009, when he taught us, he was quite probably, I think, in my opinion, grooming me then and had an eye on me. There were things that he said to me even that year in 2009 that really stuck out to me, and I wrote them in my book.
On reflection.
On
comments
reflection.
That he makes. At the time, you didn't read anything into it, but looking back...
Looking back, he came right up to me.
Yep.
As a 14-year-old girl, looked down his nose at me, really close to my hairline. And this is a 6'2", he would have been 57 at this time, 6'2" man asking, was I going grey?
Yeah.
Which is a term, we have the term for that, which I learned last year, which is negging. It's deliberately putting somebody down so that they feel like they have to win back.
That came across in the book, the amount of manipulation that was almost like I need to please him. He's put me down. My self-identity is insecure to start with, and trying to come back and I want to make this person like me, respect me, or whatever.
Even the first encounter or the first memory that I had of this man, which I didn't think anything of at the time, I just was like, who is this person who's making kind of a big fuss? He was quite a caricature of a man anyway. I mean, like the example that I gave before when we were talking about when he remarked on my friend's septum piercing and said, you're like one of the tribal women I killed. It's quite cartoonish almost. Like you just don't say that sort of, or you don't often hear commentary like that, which again, he said these things often. One time he'd done something to his wrist. Somebody asked him what happened. He said, I fell out of bed having a threesome. He just said this stuff all the time.
Comments like that, they're all these red flags, aren't they?
Yeah, but this...
As a child, you probably wouldn't realise
This was the fabric of desensitization that he knitted around everyone and created a climate of just that's his persona. And we as children, without such a strong radar for this, without a context or frame of reference as adults to compare it to, because we were children, we just thought, oh, he's Mr. Bester, that's who he is, he's funny.
Quirky.
Yeah, he's weird.
Yeah. And that's, so by doing that, desensitising, do you think he's also setting up a defence not just for the kids, but for his work colleagues around him? Are they looking at him going, he's a bit out there, but that's just who he is?
And the statement that the then principal, Robin Cronenberg, wrote after he was reported contained lots of damning evidence that, aside from the sexual offending, so often, because he was the head of maths and science, often he would have to give speeches, sometimes to visiting professionals, teachers at the school. And there were times when he allegedly gave speeches that had racist undertones, for example, and people would complain. And his response, according to the statement that was 16 pages long, it was full of examples like this, his response would be to issue a grievance.
Yeah, I made note of that. He threatened grievances that should others take issue with him. Yeah. And again, it's just that controlling and the inappropriate comments.
It's to reverse it's to diminish the initial offence, to take blame off of him, and it's to reverse the role of the offender and the victim. It's a classic technique. It's the Darvo technique. The deny, attack, reverse the victim and offender roles.
Right. It's he also put himself up as a man of faith.
Yes, a practicing Catholic, he calls himself. Yeah, he plays the organ.
A hypocrite.
Well, I mean, look, there's just many examples that you could hold up, and
So When did you realise that he was grooming you, or whether that's the right word? When did you realise it had crossed the line?
I had no, I mean, well, it's hard to say. Like, it's almost, no, there's no single crystal thought
Yes.
that is you are holding in your head, especially as a kid, at one time throughout that process. It's this sort of coagulation of both feelings and thoughts. It's just fear is sort of running. You're running on adrenaline, and because what's happening is your biology is being weaponized against you, really, and that's what.
Explain what you mean by that.
Well, perpetrators and often they want to call themselves, these minor attracted persons, which is really a load of rubbish. Part of the reason why I believe child sex offenders pick children as their targets is because they know that children are still developing neurologically, physically, and socially. And therefore, because children are supposed to depend on adults for their behaviour modelling, they know that children are most liable to mimicry.
Yep.
So especially if you start isolating them from all of their good, positive networks and their good, positive examples of behaviour and lesson giving, the child's going to start mimicking what you do.
Yeah.
That's because they should. That's the whole purpose of childhood is to integrate your experiences from your environment and from the people around you. So that's why they pick them.
Yeah.
And that's not a social construct or a legal principle. That is a fact of evolutionary biology, and it's an incontrovertible fact of evolutionary biology. That is nature and nurture, which are actually inseparable when you think about it, because what is your DNA? It is a codified set of genetic instructions.
Yeah, that's a way of looking at it.
You just copy, and any creature, any animal begins to adapt, begins to mold to its environment in order to survive that environment, no matter what it is.
Yeah.
And there are different ways that we do that. I was 5'3", he was 6'2", and he was very manipulative. And in the early days of him he invited me into his office, and he encouraged this conversational element. And I had known him again from the year before. Yeah. And I thought he was funny, and he was providing this connection that I lacked. I didn't have I didn't have somebody who spent a decent amount of time with me.
Showing you interest in you, and I would imagine.
Yeah, and interest in a way that, he often says, she wanted it, which is a interesting phrase to use, because, sure, a friendship in that sort of way, because, my mother had, all through my childhood, she worked as a newsreader, which meant she came home from work late. Yep. And I also played a lot of sports, and I spent this divided time with my parents all through my life. And I lived a very lonely life, even though I did have good friendships and relationships with my cousins. At the end of the day, all I had was myself that I went home to. Yeah. I didn't have a sibling. And then when my brother was born that year in 2010, that was a tough time. My stepdad was working really late. My mum was 45 when she had him, and it was just a tough time. Yeah. And that's okay. It's nobody's fault. Those were just the circumstances. And again, perpetrators often pick those, they can see it. They pick those circumstances. They also often pick careers deliberately that give them access to children. And we've just seen a horrific example of that in Queensland with the childcare worker.
Yeah, that was horrendous.
Over 1,623 charges. Yeah. It's just horrific. You just don't want to even picture it. But often they say for every conviction that a perpetrator gets, there's at least 30 other victims that you don't even know about.
Yeah, I think that probably pretty fair assessment.
Probably pretty fair. But, in the early days of this grooming, when he was inviting me into his office, I was going home and just saying to my mum, like, oh, Mr. Bester and I were talking. He had me in his office today, and the red flags were going up for them. Now, the words like grooming were not in anyone's vernacular really at that time.
Yeah.
It was not a common word that was being spoken about or being used, but they still thought it was inappropriate. And at that time, my parents had 2 meetings with the school to request that he stay away from me. Then the day after my little brother Oscar was born, I had a meeting with Mr. Bester and Mrs. Cronenberg, the principal.
Yeah, I'm feeling uncomfortable how the system let you down. It let you down.
Well,
your parents have brought this attention.
Yes. Yeah, because he'd given me a key to his office. Warning.
Yeah.
And again, it also, when I think about it, it was part of that was really clever too, because I was also groomed. I was being socially engineered into the feeling of fear of him, and also into the feeling that I was doing something wrong and that I was participating actively in something that was bad. And so that, and yet, but I didn't understand. It was far beyond my capacity of understanding. I was participating in something that I just thought I didn't understand why. Also, I was being reprimanded because there was no sexual.
I find it incomprehensible that you get dragged into the office, the headmistress office, with the person.
No one was being really direct with me as to why this was inappropriate.
It would be
because
so
I was
confusing.
also sharing with, I shared with my parents the details that were. I shared with my parents the details that he was, or the stories, the anecdotes, a lot of them that he was sharing with me, including hazing rituals that he alleged that he, was engaged in when he was younger, which were quite disturbing stories, like young boys being made to stay outside in sub-zero or freezing weather, cold weather, and straddle war memorial cannons so their penises would stick. Yeah. Like things like that he was sharing with me, which again, I guess that's a sexual undertone. But I told my parents that, and I guess that fed into part of their feeling alarmed.
I would imagine they'd feel alarmed. But again, and this is where the system has failed. Like, they've gone to the school.
They had 2 meetings with the school. And after meeting with the principal and Mr. Bester, who sat opposite me, almost as if, like, the optics of it too, where I remember, like, there's me in my uniform and there's these 2 teachers sitting opposite me. And I felt like I was doing something wrong. And I obeyed, but I also didn't want to see this man. I remember right before the meeting, I tried to see him before the meeting, and because I felt really bad, and because this is something that I thought was a friendship, and I'd remembered that he'd mentioned something that he liked.
So you're feeling like you've done something wrong.
I felt like I'd done something wrong, and, I wrote about all of this in the book. I'm very open about, but it's also evidence of, like, there's this kid who's, I think about it all and I go, oh, there's this kid who's just, looking up to this person and really wanting to please this person, and who's being also confused about what this connection is. Yeah. And the seeds of grooming, and he also, like, so on the nose, he played this song, The Sound of Silence, always in his office. Like, it was all very eerie. When I look back on it, it was this completely eerie backdrop that he had also to weave it all in together. And after that, I just stayed away from him because I thought, this is so creepy. Yeah. And then
Grace, did you walk away from that meeting thinking you and him were both in trouble for something, but you're confused? Like, what was?
Yeah, after that meeting, I just stayed away. Okay. I stayed away.
Yeah.
And the next time there was an interaction between him and I was at a rehearsal for a school play that I was in. It was a weekend, and Miss Polly, who was directing the school play, came down. I was with my friend Jillian, and Miss Polly said, "Mr. Bester is here to see you." And there was just like, it was a sliding doors moment, and Miss Polly clearly didn't know about the restrictions that were placed on him or me to not see him. And I just remember following her. It was like
You're a kid at school.
But you're also just, it was like you get locked into, it's like you're in a game that you're a player in a game that you can't control. You're a chess piece being moved by somebody else who has far more power than you do. It was like, I remember it as if it were yesterday, because I remember following him from the Performing Arts Centre to the science block. I just remember following him. And I remember what he was wearing. I remember what I was wearing. And he'd asked me months prior, when we had been having conversations in his office one time, and it had been brushed off as if it was just a random question. But because he'd known about me having an eating disorder, and he'd asked me a lot about that. He'd asked me if I had ever drawn myself naked to help me with my recovery. And also, it was very well known in the school. Like, I drew one of the posters for one of the plays.
Knew that you could draw.
Knew that I could draw. It was always known that I could draw. And so it was almost like the way that he sexualized, if you will, the way that he introduced this concept was almost like he did it in a way that it was cushioned around all these other things that were kind of just normal. And so it was a bit odd, but it was also it just sort of seamlessly
confusing
fell into the conversation, and I just went, no, whatever. And I didn't think about it then, but one of the first things he asked me when we got up into this science block, where I hadn't had any classes with him, he asked me if I'd done that sketch. And that's where it's very hard to describe what the feeling of that is. Because it's like, then you're in, and it's like, how do you go back in time from there? And it's almost like you realize, all these other things, like I'm sitting here and I think back about, you start to unpick, and you're like, what were all of these other things, and were all these other things
it all starts to connect, and you see what was going on.
Yeah, and then from there it spiraled, and it built into what eventually became the offending. But what happened was, I had never drawn myself naked. I had art books. Some of the art books did have naked people in them. Yep. I drew one of these figures in there, and I didn't put a head on the body. And I remembered him asking me to give him this sketch and to give it to him in his pigeonhole, and it was all this very very weird way of going about it, and very incremental. And after I gave it to him, he was insistent on repaying me, and it was all very vague. And I sort of said to him, "No, there's no need to repay me." And it was like kind of just like trying to walk back something that you couldn't walk back.
Yeah.
And he asked if I would stay back after school one evening, and we went back into this room in the science block. And you can't make this up. Like, he just sort of said that he had the door behind him, and it was this, he'd heard from me about what I had described this older child had done to me with the closet.
Yeah.
And it was that I was going to go into the room. He had a piece of paper that had yes.
So is it just I'm just sitting here mortified that that's how low he's stooping.
Yeah.
Okay, so he's.
Yeah, he had this yellow piece of paper that he'd written yes on one side and no on the other. And again, that's with this false pretense that I had any power in that situation. I mean, again, I'm a child. He's like 6'2". He's a soldier before he was a teacher. I mean, he told us about all that sort of stuff like that. The stories he used to tell, even of just like, there's one that I put in the book of how, in his words, he'd pretended to be retarded on a bus in South Africa so that he didn't have to give up his seat for a pregnant woman. Just stuff like that, where it's not a threat, but it's a veiled communication that this is who I am and this is what I'll do.
He's manipulating and controlling you the whole way through, isn't
he? It's banal, though. It's also just so banal, and it's not something you have to exaggerate. You don't have to put any kind of... That's just what it was. It was so slow, and that's the part that, like, it didn't move, and that's the part that's scary. I remember it all. I remember the pace of it being like that, where you couldn't... It was like moving in, like... Oh, I remember his laugh. I remember the like his teeth. I remember, and he's a big man. He's overbearing. He's dominant. He's like yuck.
Yeah, and you're a kid.
Yeah, and he had this system of fail-safes that he created. He recruited people that enabled him to operate. And it involved other children.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, you think he goes to that level. How long did this sexual abuse go on for?
Yeah, the sexual abuse started in the middle of the year, and it continued until the end of 2010. And I requested that it stop. I was in a lot of pain. It was unpleasant for the reasons that you can imagine. And I did my best where I could. But he also he took up every inch of my life in every way. I had this job. My first job as a young teenager was working at the Cornelian Bay Boathouse, and even the employers, even the owners of the boathouse, remarked to the other girl who was working in the kiosk there where I worked that they would notice that I was like breaking down and crying in the cool room, because he would often come to my work and just like he stalked me there. He was turning up to my house at night and sitting in his car, and he would often, like, I would have to sneak out, and I was getting in trouble with my parents. It was getting harder and harder to maintain this, like, he surveilled me online with these fake Facebook profiles, and it was so hard to upkeep. Like, there was nothing normal about it.
Yeah.
And it was, I was playing a role. And he'd mentioned to me one night after a parent-teacher that he'd had to sit next to or be near the sister of a girl that he'd clearly sexually interacted with.
Yeah.
A former student. And it was all just getting like it's almost like the spell of grooming was there. And like I said, it was like, no, there were no clear thoughts, you know, because there's always this fear. And then there was this like, almost like if you, like, it's like mind control. Like part of you is, it's like you're addicted to a drug almost, but then it's like becomes pain. And then, but I just was like, this, I can't live like this. I hate this. I hate myself. I was self-harming. I was drinking to be able to cope. My friend Megan, she would receive messages from me where I had, I would fall asleep on my bedroom floor in my school uniform and wake up the next day because I had drunk whole glasses of vodka to go to sleep. Just to sleep. My parents thought, well, I was diagnosed temporarily with bipolar because I was so, like, my behavior had changed so dramatically in his presence, which I couldn't escape from. Like I said, he was there all the time. He made himself present. He inserted himself
in your life
constantly in such an, like, if there is a relationship, quote unquote, and this is not a relationship, this is why we have made this reform now that's harmonized across, in no jurisdiction in Australia is it called a relationship where an adult offends against a child, because it isn't. It is just not that. It is abuse, always is, always will be abuse of a child. But, you know, if there are two people that love each other, where there is love, there's no need to force anything at all. And this was force. It was him inserting himself into my life. And that's what he did actually in the outset. He forced his way into my life, like he forced his way into my body. The first time he tried to penetrate me, my body blocked him, you know. And when he abused me, often he abused me on the floor. Like, he abused me during my period. Like, it was gross, you know. And like, when I ended up speaking out, you know, it was, and reporting him to police. Like, yeah, it was a tough time.
Grace, I just look, I make a decision here. Like, I feel bad even making you relive what you've gone through.
Like, it's
with
just,
it, so.
you see it almost, and every survivor of childhood sexual abuse that I've spoken to, that I know, that I'm close with. I mean, Steve Fisher, who's one of my best friends, he's been speaking about this for 22 years. He was the first survivor of childhood sexual abuse who ever spoke out in Tasmania, who was abused in the clergy. Like, all of us, we see it in different ways every day, and it's okay, you know. And I share what I want to share, and that's fine. But I also appreciate you recognising the toll. But, you know,
I think for people to understand, you don't need all the details. Just think what has happened here, and
that's not all of them. Like, there's stuff that will never make it, you know, and that's, or maybe one day at a different time. But, you know, and what my mother went through, you know, when she went finally to the university. Yeah,
let's talk the steps from. You've gone to the police. At what stage did you go to the police? What time?
I went to the police in April of 2011. Yep. So, you know, I was really struggling in 2011 to. I was going to.
How old were you then?
I was 16 then. I turned, because my birthday's in the end of the year. So.
And what advice did you go to your parents first, or did you go to the police?
I actually went to another teacher first. I went to Dr. Simon. He was new to the school, so I knew that he wouldn't have been entrenched in that tradition, the culture, but also, you know, wouldn't defer to the hierarchy. Or be sort of, you know, not that loyalty is necessarily a bad thing, but wouldn't be loyal in a bad way to the institution, and that he would put, people before policy, you know, bad policy, and the individual before the institution. Certainly in this case, the right individual, I thought. And I wouldn't be able to live with myself if it happened to somebody else. Yeah. So, you know, I could at least perhaps stop it from happening to somebody else. All I could think of was how to get this person out of the school. I didn't have a concept of the legal system. I was 16 then, just turned 16. You know, I was really struggling at school. I was struggling in my classes. And I went to Mr. Simon, who's now, as I said, he's Dr. Simon. And He was also gay. I knew that he'd probably faced ostracisation, discrimination himself in many ways. Told him, and he accompanied me to the principal's office a few days later. And so did my friend Renee. She came as well to support me. And I told the principal. And after that, everything just sort of got taken out of my hands, really. Yeah. It's sad to look back on that. Like I remember disclosing to the police not long afterwards, and I had 2 officers interrogating me. That's what it felt like. It felt like an interrogation.
Yeah, I'm hoping policing has improved there, because you need to allow the victim of these matters to still feel like they've got control. I would imagine, like
especially kids.
Once you've reported it, just be snowballing along, and you'd be going, what's happened now?
Often this, as with any crime that is reported by an accused party, you often just become another witness in your own experience, and you're considered.
It's just so far not, is it?
Yeah, and things I think will change, and it's especially important when we consider the level of training that is needed, in particular about these crimes, which are perpetrated by a particularly high level of offender who's calculated, studied, often has done it several times before by the time they get actually accused and caught.
When you went to the principal's office and reported it, was he removed from the school?
Yeah, he was suspended with pay.
Okay, and then how long after was he charged?
Not long after. I don't think. Again, I was still a child. I think it might have been. It didn't take them long. There was a lot of contemporaneous evidence because it was so soon after the offending.
Did you have to go to court?
No, I didn't, because he pleaded guilty. Yep. He pleaded guilty.
And he got sentenced.
Sentenced for the 2. So there were 2 offences.
Yep.
There was the possession of child exploitation material. Because he was found with 28 files of child exploitation material on his home computer. And then there was the offence which was previously known as maintaining a sexual relationship with a person under the age of 17, which is now called in Tasmania the persistent sexual abuse of a child.
Right, okay. So recognising it with a bit more.
And he even said himself, he had a throwaway line which was, I had sex with her 20 or 30 times. Yeah. Which, we know what sex with a child is. It's not sex with a child. It is rape. And it was also underpinned by stealthy, consistent grooming, which went on for probably about a year or more, actually, in reality. Yeah. But I left out a lot in my report because I was a child and didn't have a concept of it, and didn't even know the word grooming, didn't learn that until I was 22 years old. Yeah. But he admitted to doing it. He downplayed it, of course, as is typical of a child sex offender. But he was sentenced to 2 years and 10 months in prison for those combined offences.
It's not a lot of time, is it?
He got out after a year and 9 months on good behaviour. And almost immediately after he got out in 2013, he was awarded a federally funded PhD scholarship to study chemistry at the University of Tasmania. And he was put into student accommodation as well with undergraduate students who are about 18 years old, a lot of them, that had shared shower facilities as well.
How the hell does that happen?
I don't know. You tell me, Gary.
It's a failing in the system.
Multiple.
That could happen. Your mum picked up your cause, but on it.
She did. So my mum's one of 9 sisters. She's right in the middle of them. Okay. She's got 4 older full sisters and 4 younger half sisters.
All right. And so you've got some cousins there.
She's got lots of cousins. And so only the eldest sister of the 9 got to go to university, and they grew up in the working classes, and all of them have done well. A lot of mum's sisters have done really well to come up, and mum did really well, and she worked up to the middle class and made good. But she never got to go to university. She finally got to go and study, happened to be there at the same time as Mr. Bester. And she was studying behavioural sciences. She's not since gone back because it was too traumatic, her experience.
I can imagine.
Because actually in 2015, a little bit of background just really quickly. So in 2014, September 2014, I saw an article that examined the findings from a then recent study about social attitudes towards victims of rape. And I'd never shared anything about my experience about what happened. I was living overseas at the time. But I shared a little bit of writing to go with this article about the psychological experience of what it felt like to be abused and to lose your trust in humanity in such a brutal way. And he had his own Facebook, Bester had his own Facebook at that time, and he must have seen the post. He cited the exact date that I had made that post, and he wrote, "You are not immune, you are not unassailable." And he ended this post, which was veiled and threatening, with words to the effect of, it was sort of a plan, it seemed like, in my opinion, to take some kind of action in response along the lines of just that involved some harmless banter between friends. And then, it was just a thought, ... And my mother actually shared this with Tasmania Police, who agreed that it was probably a veiled threat, but they didn't take any action. And, of course, the question remains why he actually had access to a social media platform as a child sex offender who was on the sex offender register at that time. Anyway, fast forward a few months later to early 2015, and, in what he would later defend was a random provocation that came out of nowhere, he was... somebody online on a public Facebook thread, pointed him out because he was making some inappropriate comments about something, and somebody said, "Oh, aren't you this person?" and pulled up an article from the original offending that was about the original offending, and he said, "I had a sexual relationship with a person younger than 17. How many others do this?" And then proceeded to list a number of Tasmanian suburbs where one might find somebody engaging in the same activity.
What a creep.
Yeah. And then he boasted about it. He said that it was awesome and enviable, and that based on all the emails and tweets he had received, most men in Australia envy him.
He's got no comprehension, is it? No conscience, no...
And... in the outset, because the internet was, still is a very lawless place, and there was some question in the early days about whether this was a punishable offence, but eventually, it was prosecuted. Yep. And my mother wore the brunt of that. She really was at the forefront of that fight, and it was a lengthy legal battle. There were pleas of not guilty, but he eventually pleaded not guilty. And it actually set a national precedent because it was the first case of somebody being charged and convicted with the crime of producing child exploitation material in descriptive form. And then he was sentenced to a further...
That's significant.
Yeah, it was. It was the first case of that, and he was sentenced to a further 4 months in prison. He served 11 weeks. And this is all while he was still studying at the University of Tasmania. And my mother argued, clearly he must have broken the student code of conduct, but the university held firm and they allowed him to keep studying.
What the hell?
On the university campus.
I'm getting angry just listening to the
and the point that was eventually made by another vice chancellor, not the vice chancellor at the time, who defended his position and ability to eligibility to study there. Another vice chancellor sort of eventually asked the question of people, the university administration, like, would you let this guy babysit your children?
Yeah.
So why would you allow him to study? This is not somebody who's, because people often say, like, we need criminals to be able to redeem themselves. Like, yes, usually, but we're talking about a whole range of criminality here, and this is somebody who has proven that when in this particular context, which is an environment where people...
I think the risk factor
are
outweighs.
learning, and there are also young children there who are in the High Achievers program, where people who are still high school age go to the university and they participate in courses. This is a child sex offender who's now a twice convicted child sex offender and has demonstrated repeatedly that they don't have any remorse, but also they have a penchant for doing this.
Yeah.
We're not barring criminals in a blanket way. That's not what anybody is suggesting. So that's disingenuous, that argument, if anyone is making that argument, which no one has. It's just him. This is what I believe in life. Everyone needs to be treated on a case-by-case basis, whether you're a man, a woman, wherever you come from. Treat people on a case-by-case basis. This case is a particularly egregious case where he keeps showing what he's capable of.
Yeah, 100%. 100%.
Yeah.
Like, I take it the university did eventually
Yes.
get him rid
And
of
then
him.
in the end, they said, "Oh, this is like a once in a 50-year mistake or something like that." That's what they said to my mother, and
yeah.
we were all kind of like, "I don't know if it was a mistake."
Well, it's not a mistake. If it's pointed out to people, I can understand a mistake if they just didn't realise, but when it's pointed out to them in as much detail as it was, anyone that could argue against or arguing to allow him to stay there in that environment.
Yes.
Another thing that you had success with on the basis of the way that you've dealt with the abuse is being able to being given a voice.
Yeah.
The changing of the legislation.
Yeah.
Explain that.
Thanks to Nina Fennell, she's the investigative journalist who contacted my mum after that. Those sort of experiences with the University of Tasmania, and then eventually contacted me as well, realising that there was obviously the story behind my mother's experience of injustice. And Nina was sort of working with me, hearing my disclosure, and then it was my mother who actually alerted her to the reality that there was a prohibitive law in Tasmania that would bar me from speaking publicly about my experiences, and Nina was horrified, and then she
It seems ridiculous. But,
and so Nina asked News Corporation's senior legal counsel Gina McWilliams about what this specific piece of legislation was. It was Section 194K of Tasmania's Evidence Act. And then Nina, used her campaigning experience. She's got a lot of campaigning specifically on this issue of sexual assault. She's done a lot of incredible work. She did the hashtag Justice Shouldn't Hurt campaign.
Yep.
She's actually based here in New South Wales, Nina. She lives on the Central Coast. And she pulled together some other organisations and formed a really strong coalition with End Rape on Campus Australia, with rape and sexual assault research and advocacy, and with Mark Lawyers, who did the legal work. They're based here in New South Wales as well, the legal firm, and with, most importantly, 16 other brave survivors of abuse who lent their stories to this cause, which became eventually a nationwide push to return the power back to people who really never had the power in the first place. And from there, so my case was sort of the test case, if you will.
Yep.
And from there, it grew into this really powerful movement, and I got a court order in 2019, and then the law in Tasmania was overturned. It was reformed in 2020.
Yeah, it's a big move. It's a big move, and again, it's just making life harder for them. Like, instead of hiding behind using the legislation to protect themselves, it allows you guys to talk about it so people understand what actually takes place.
And what's important, as always, is it's on the terms of the person who has the least power and control in whatever the circumstances are. So if you wish not to speak about it as well, if you wish to remain silent, that is your prerogative. It always has to be the choice of the victim survivor.
You've made that point a few times, and I agree with you. Otherwise, we're taking the victim, if they're being criticised for the way they're handling a situation, has just been abused again. It's just been adding to the trauma. And I think that's a good point to make. This is the way that you've dealt with it, and it's worked for you, but each case is an individual.
And that can change over time, because life is this sort of, it's this amorphous thing. It moves in a different direction, and at different times, especially when if something's happened to you as a child and you reach different milestones. I haven't had children, for example. When I have children, it's probably going to reframe it in a whole different context, because I'll have to then be completely responsible for the love and care of that little person. Who's a child. They're not an adult. They're a child, and I have to be solely responsible for their needs, and that will. That'll add a whole nother layer, which I can't even imagine. I've never done that. I've never, I've looked after children, but I've never, ever had to be their sole,
Change your perspective on things.
Yeah.
The Grace Tame Foundation. Don't deny it. You're involved in it.
Oh, yes.
Okay.
Oh, it's a really creative name that we came up with there.
Well, that must have
thought about it for a long time.
Thinking. My reading of it is about creating structural change.
That's right.
And almost codifying it across the country, the legislation. So we're not dealing with all these different interpretations. Do you want to just talk to us about the Grace Tame Foundation and what you hope to achieve?
Yeah, sure. So we've really got three main pillars. So our main mission statement really is to create initiatives in order to prevent and respond to child sexual abuse. And, further to that, the three pillars that really support it, the areas that we focus on in order to fulfill that mission are the structural reform. So that's both like legal and policy reform. And then we've got the education piece. And that's really making child sexual abuse the focus, and the gap that we've seen in particular is around grooming. So the behavioural stuff that that underpins the incidents, because we hear a lot about the incidents in the media. They get a lot of headlines, the graphic, gory details we hear about, but that's stuff that people switch off from. They go, that's too confronting.
Yeah.
But the behavioural piece, that's also where we can, again, do a lot of the preventative work, give people the tools, especially kids, to identify. And then the other piece is the survivor support, which we do in the form of philanthropic funding for the legal work of child sexual abuse survivors. So every month, as the CEO, part of my job is to do the approvals and read a brief case history of everyone that we give legal support to.
Okay, and that clearly it's an area that you're passionate about, and this is where you see your future. Is this at this stage?
Yeah, at this stage, yeah.
Yeah. Well, good on you. I think the fact that you're making that, and I just touch on that grooming and then that coercive control. We really need to be able to set up that grooming is an offence in itself.
Yep.
Like it might be a little bit more complicated because police being police, we like it black and white, and the offence has occurred. But wouldn't it be good if we really feed into that, create legislation that if what was happening to you in the lead up to it would be considered a criminal offence? Yeah,
and there are ways to do that in legislation where you can create definitional and provisional specificity that doesn't limit. So you can say grooming includes but isn't limited to X, Y, Z, and so on and so forth. Because we often think of it is this sort of invisible, abstract concept. However, it often includes measurable acts. Within that sort of framework that was actually conceptualised by a pair of psychologists in America, Dr. Elizabeth G. Glick and Georgia M. Winters, who wrote a paper, and they sort of came up with this map that's, it starts off with targeting, then it's gaining trust from the victim, then it's filling a need, and then it's isolation, and then there's the sexualizing, and then there's the maintaining control. But within that framework, you've got things that are measurable, like the gift giving, like the solicitation of imagery. So, like in my case, there was the solicitation of an actual physical drawing.
Okay, so it is something. The way you're describing it, it's something that's workable.
Yeah, and then you've got bribery, gift giving, solicitation of imagery, blackmail, the conversations, all of those things, they fit into that grooming synthesis. And when we start to understand that, like, okay, so there's grooming, but what are the physical acts that constitute grooming or can be considered grooming behaviours that are actual physical acts?
And maybe what you've just described there, and my little mind's ticking over here, it could be like a restraining order. If someone's gone down that path, take a restraining order out on the person.
Sure.
Things like that. So it's
lots of things that you can do.
There's things that could be done. I'm mindful of the time. We've gone longer than I promised you we would, but I've just got one more question that I want to ask. You've got to name the person I'm talking about here, and this is an extract from your book. I'll delete the name, I'll take that out. Was the first man to be strong enough to just be vulnerable with me without trying to say or do the right thing. Who am I referring to? This could be embarrassing.
Oh, yeah, my fiance, Max. I love Max.
There you go. You've described him as Max is the manliest man that you've come across. That strength isn't in the absence of vulnerability; it's the ability to face it without fear or shame.
That's right.
So you've found you've got some joy in your life, and
But yeah, and vulnerability, it must be said, vulnerability, pain, these are human experiences. They don't discriminate by sex, they don't discriminate by age or any other factor at all. You know, I think that's really important.
well, I think what's important is the work that you're doing, and you've turned a situation a horrible situation into a positive. And I don't think you realise, like I mentioned to a few people that I had you come in on the podcast, and the amount of people that you inspire and the work that you do. So, full credit to you.
Well, thanks, Gary. It's a positive feedback loop. You know, I get my inspiration and my courage and strength from all the positive connections that I have with people, and I get, you know, it's the little but powerful impacts. You know, the other day when we were in the NT and we did a press conference, and afterwards this middle-aged guy, probably would have been about your age. No, you're young. You're 30,
30
35.
31, 32.
Yeah, he was 30 years old. But he just hung back and he had tears in his eyes.
Yeah.
You know, he said, I didn't realise, he obviously was just part of this media crew, and he just, you get jobs and you turn up. He said, I didn't realise what this was about.
Yeah.
And he said, that was one of the best press conferences I've been to in a while. He said, I'm also a survivor.
Yeah, okay.
And we had a hug.
That's beautiful.
That stuff.
Yeah.
And those moments happen, and I remember all of them,
you
know, and those are the things that just, And it's really the greatest, I say this, and I mean it, it's the greatest privilege of my entire life to be just a witness as well as a part of a time where, you know, because I still remember what it was like to feel like I was a pariah in my hometown, to the point where I wanted to leave and just be anonymous. And, you know, because it's hard to engage with media, and I do it sort of, you know, where it can be really hard, and make choices about what I do and don't do. But that sort of stuff makes it worth it, to be able to witness everyone finding their own power and being somebody's someone.
Yeah. Well, good on you, Grace Tame. And I hope we can speak again down the track. But thanks very much for coming on the podcast.
Thank you. And thank you for the work that you do. It's really important, Gary.
Cheers.